You've said that luck really just means frequent access to flow. When it comes to things like happiness, joy, meaning, and purpose, are all these emotions that can feel intangible and hard to define, are they really just romanticized words for flow as well?
That's kind of an awesome question. So, meaning is a distinct system in the brain from flow, but when flow shows up at the same time as meaning, we tend to really believe those things. So, for example, I have had done work with a lot of three-letter agencies and points in the military. What happens in a terrorist training camp? They First, they do standard brainwashing techniques to loosen up your right, keep people up late, don't give them food, tilt their consciousness, and then be very nice to them and put them into flow and teach them new things. And they will adopt the new beliefs. And that's how you create a zealot. Like it's a known, like that's what you do. And by the way, that formula is not new. If you read 1984, that's based on actual brainwashing techniques used in, I want to say, World War One, that Orwell was writing about. So this is not new news, right? This is very old news, but it's not particularly well incorporated into how, when I work with the military, I always explain to them you're dealing with an addiction. You think you're dealing with something that's being caused by social or class or politics. You're dealing with a physical addiction, and you have to treat it like an addiction. If you actually, so we've had those conversations. So meaning is separate from flow, but purpose is separate from flow, but woven in very much. And some of it gets really weird. So I'll give you an example. Autonomy, which is the drive to steer our own ship. You wouldn't think that has anything to do with flow, but it turns out autonomy and focus are coupled systems in the brain. So you can't pay maximum attention to something if you're not you're not doing it by choice. So you can't actually get into flow without like sort of free will in that kind of direction and things like that. And so some of those systems, they're not the same thing. They are neurologically distinct, but they are super related. You can't have one without the other. And some of them are now the same thing. So happiness is now, there are three tiers of happiness. The first one is, how do you feel right here, right now? That's not a flow based thing at all. It's based on a bunch of other stuff. The flow can impact how happy you feel. But the next two definitions, the next level up is enjoyment. Second best we get to feel on the planet is enjoyment. It's defined as a high flow activity where the thing that's driving us into flow is aligned with our goals. The best we get to feel on the planet is purpose. And that's when the thing that we're trying to do that drives us into flow helps people greater than ourselves. There's all kinds of evolutionary reasons for this. Like it's really good for the species, and we can go into that if you want, but they're very intertwined and they're very intertwined systems. But purpose is a thing where flow is a state of consciousness, and right, flow will underpin purpose, will strengthen it, will drive it forward. You can't really have purpose without a lot of flow. I mean, you can, but it doesn't work so well. But it's a great question, and it's funny because when I first came in and started doing this work, I was asking a similar question, but at a different scale. I was like, are mystical experiences flow states? Like when somebody gets into a trance state while meditating, are we talking about, like, we didn't know. Now we know, oh, they're slightly different and related, but we know how they're different and we know how they're related. We have not understood the neurobiology. But in the beginning, that was the biggest hurdle to this work, was people thought flow were mystical experiences, and nobody wanted to talk about mystical experiences out loud because you sounded flaky, right? There was an anti-religion bias, especially in the 80s and the 90s. And so that was one of the big hurdles, coming in.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. And when I was reading some of your books and going over your work, I think that's the thing that helped me the most, where it really concretized things and made it feel tangible rather than thinking about these things like happiness, joy, where it's like, okay, like what does that truly mean? Where it's like, okay, like let's stick to.
Well, that's what you got. You got it first. That's what drove me into the neuroscience in the first place. It's like, what the fuck are all these synonyms? When I was a little kid, I had a problem with synonyms. Like, I didn't understand, there were a lot of names for body parts, and I didn't understand that a lot of those names were the same thing. I was like, do women have like 7 things down there? Because there's so many terms. I'm very confused. Um, and I sort of felt the same way when I like started to learn psychology in college, and I started trying to figure this stuff out. I was like, what do all these fucking terms mean? They're so squishy. In fact, I just had last week, Scott Barry Kaufman was on our podcast, and he's a psychologist and a great friend of mine. And we had our forever argument, which is I don't like psychology because it's squishy, and he doesn't like neurobiology because he doesn't think it gets you far enough into, whatever. And we actually had the same argument, but I'm on your side. Like, I look at all the terms of psychology and I'm like, the best thing that these are anchored in is somebody came up with a model. And a model doesn't get me very far. It's still like it's a finger pointing at the moon. It's not the moon, and they're reductive. And if you're trying to, I find that models, again, and this is why psychologists bug me and they get into trouble. Coaches figure out what works for them and train other people. Psychologists find a model that aligns with their personality and they train people from that model. And when not all psychologists, but I've seen that happen as well. And it always, that was the stuff that made me crazy. Not because I thought I was like, it's not useful. I can't, maybe this is useful for some people, right? Because obviously I was Scott Barry Kaufman, incredibly useful for him. He can train himself and steer himself from the psychology. And there's probably a ton of people who are like that. I'm like you. I was baffled. I was like, I'm not smart enough, or I can't figure this out, or like, one of the things that I think is really fun about having a Vipassana meditation practice is you start getting a really clear sense of exactly what do we mean by joy? What do we like? Those are actually like, those are real things in the body. They have geometry, they have shape, they have tingling sensations, and like there's actually physicality to them. And when you actually get good at the sort of the interoceptive part that comes along with Vipassana meditation, you're like, oh shit, I can start to answer some of these questions. But especially at the beginning of my journey, I was baffled. I was like you. I was like, I don't know what you're freaking talking about. Give me something. How does it work? Tell me how it works.
I think I like the psychological side of things as well, but I know for me that it needs to be balanced with the data and the science behind it. And I think that's something that like just recently I kind of made that realization about myself and what has really helped me.
I will tell you, by the way, that one of the I think one of the signs of like the development of expertise, more mature intellects. I always say that like the smarter people start to realize that you have to know, like it's not even, you're going to learn the psychology. You got the biology, the neuroscience, you learn the psychology, and then you're like, oh fuck, I need the embodied cognition. Oh, I need the history of mind. And I always say, people ask me like, what do you think your job really is? And I say, I think my job is to translate between languages. And what I mean by that is the neurochemistry folks don't speak the same language as the computational neuroscientists who can't talk to the cognitive psychologists, et cetera, the embodied cognitive people. And I think because I started out as a journalist, I had this wide view. That was what I saw. I was like, oh, wow, if we could get all these people talking to one another, we're going to get somewhere. Because what I started to notice, especially when I was interviewing top scientists, I was like, it's not that the really good ones, they don't just know vertical. They don't have a vertical. They're not just depth. They're width. They can tell me how this idea relates to this idea in this field, and it goes out a little bit. And I was like, oh, there's something here. I'm going to try to learn to do that and think that way. And I have found, and I always get confident around people, like I'm comfortable around people who do what you just did, where you're like, yeah, I need the psychology. I also need the neuroscience, and I probably need, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you're doing your homework. You're thinking about these things the right way. In my opinion, I could be wrong. I've just seen it so often in like the smart people who I'm like, wow, I really admire the way you think, not just like your ideas, but how they, like what you could do with them in the world. That seems to be a commonality. I also noticed that like everybody, sooner or later, you have to add evolutionary biology to your thinking. If you can't think about things in terms of evolution, that's a weakness actually in the game, in your game. That's one of the things I always tell people. If you want to get smart, like learn the psychology, learn the neuroscience, learn the evolution too. Take the time to learn a little bit about evolutionary biology and psychology, because you can't think about these things properly, I think, without it.